and welcome back to Gulf and Diaspora. I'm your host, Ria Ibrahim. In the first episode, we heard from Lijin and Aarti who shared what it was like growing up in the Gulf, learning to adapt, juggling different cultures, and carving out space for themselves in places where identity can feel a little undefined. One thing that really stood out in both their conversations was the role of language, not just as a way to talk to people, but as something that shapes who you are, where you belong, and what kind of access you have to the world around you. To dig deeper into that, I spoke with Dr. Briji Jose. She's a sociolinguist, a second generation migrant who grew up in the UAE and now teaches English literature and cultural studies at Christojanthi College in Bangalore. Dr. Jose had some really interesting insights about multilingualism, how it can be this amazing source of power and connection, but also how it can make you feel left out, especially when languages are treated differently in different places. Hi, Briji. It's so lovely to have you here. Welcome to the show. Last episode, we spoke to two second generation migrants and we learned a lot of things about their lives, including the role that language plays in their lives and how they wish they could have learned Arabic more fluently. That's what Legend said. Well, as Aarti said, that now she would like to learn Indian languages. So, in your view, how does language shape the way second generation migrants make sense of who they are, especially in places where their cultural identity might not be fully reflected?
Right. Hello, Ria. Thank you so much for having me. I think the research that I worked on was specifically second generation migrants in the Gulf region. And now this differs from other second generation migrants. So I'm not going to be generalizing, but I think specifically language on any individual has a huge effect. Let's look at Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or anything of that form where language largely determines your identity, the way you see the world, the way you understand the world. So, language that way to any individual is important. But I think specifically, my research largely was interested in the way the second generation migrant in the Gulf sort of constructs and expresses their identity. Now, I'm a second generation migrant myself. I grew up in Abu Dhabi. Now, what's interesting for us is we're sort of exposed to English as a language and then maybe our native language at home. So maybe in schools, not so much because it's a migrant land. And somewhere we're also exposed to the native country's host country's native language, which is Arabic. Now, what is interesting is for us, let's say I'm from Kerala, so my native language is Malayalam. Uh, it's not so much taught in my school. So my only exposure to that language is when I come back home, speak to my parents, and they talk to me about it, and so I pick up words and things like that. And now most second generation migrants would not also know how to read and write. So I don't know how to read and write in this language. I only know the language. I can speak the language, and English is probably, let's say, our first language, which we're exposed to at school and taught rigorously in school. But again, is it our first language? Am I as good as a native speaker? Does the language give me access to spaces that a native speaker has? Again, that's questionable. So, Arabic is a compulsory language that is taught in these migrant spaces. It is also a sort of language that we hear around in our space, not at home, but let's say in the cafes we go to, or let's say in the shops that we go to, and things like that. So it is somewhere we're exposed to, and it is also formally taught to us in school. But interestingly, a lot of us second generation migrants pick out anybody who is a non-Arab second generation migrant, though they've been exposed to the language for a very long time. I was taught to it almost 12 years in school. I was not able to speak or understand it. There's a huge teaching pedagogical gap in the way I understand the letters. I can read the letters, read it out to you perfectly well, maybe not in the correct accent, but I can identify the letters. I can probably write the letters as well. But you ask me the meaning of it, I wouldn't be able to tell you what the meaning of it is. And now that's where the pedagogical gap exists. And it's also related to the socio-cultural environments that we're brought up in, right? We're not immersed with the community. Again, this is also connected to the citizenship, migrant politics that happens there. So we don't really have access to the Arabic language. Now, as a child growing up, it didn't really affect a lot of us, and I think it didn't really affect me as well. I could speak English. Most of us of our friends would speak in English. When we came back home, we would speak in Malayalam or our native language, whatever it was, but not in a great way. I think it only hit really badly when you either when you stay back for in the country, let's say looking for employment opportunities, and you realize people who can speak Arabic have better access to it, and you, despite growing up there, have no access to the language, and you're treated as good as any other migrant despite growing up there. Or when you come back to India, you realize you don't really fit in because the English that you speak is different from the native speakers, and also the your native language you don't speak as well as the native speaker. So it's this weird positionality you exist in because your form of expression, which the only form of expression which is largely language, sort of is taken away from you, and somewhere only much later you sort of feel like, oh, but I grew up in a country and I don't have access to a language. And if I had access to a language, probably my identity, my understanding of what reality is, how I understood the culture I grew up in, my homeland is. Because technically, as second generation migrants, you never migrate. It's your parents who migrate, right? You grow up in that land. Now, the citizenship politics of the place sort of play with all of this ideas that I just spoke about. But yeah, I think specifically for second generation migrants, this language is a very complex state that they exist in.
It's such an interesting way to put it, how language really shapes how second generation migrants see themselves, especially in a place like the Gulf, where their cultural identity might not always be visible or fully accepted. And the fact that even though you're exposed to English and Arabic at such a younger age, you do not really fit in with the community in a deeper way. And it's such a complex space to exist in. I also agree with what you spoke about cultural immersion and how important that becomes, because for me, even though I'm not a second generation migrant, I know Arabic, but I'm not confident to speak the language in public spaces, and that is something that is very interesting to talk about. So that kind of leads me to my next question. In these multilingual spaces where languages like English, Arabic, and our mother tongue all exist together but aren't treated equally, how do these unspoken hierarchies affect things like how confident someone feels, or how easily they fit in, or even how they see themselves?
Correct. Yeah, that's. I think this is also a very interesting question. Also connected to when you're saying, yeah, I don't feel confident enough to speak to other communities who speak the language. I think this question sort of relates to all of that. Now, I think I can speak for UAE because I grew up there. Like you said, it's a highly migrant community. Almost 85% of the population who lives in UAE are migrants themselves, and mostly from South Asian communities, like you said, Bangladesh. Indians make up a huge number, Sri Lankans, Pakistanis, right, and Filipinos, and a lot of this community. Now, what I've observed now, this is changing. This is my experience in the late 2000s, early 2000s. Now, when I go back home, my parents are still there. I see a lot of this changing, but still, at the time that I grew up, every community would sort of seclude themselves because it's a huge community. For example, the Kerala migrant community would be huge, and they would find their community in the Gulf, and they would just form that community there. Same thing with the Filipinos, or let's say with the Pakistani community. Despite moving to another country, they would still find communities among themselves. So the need to sort of interact or find communities and find a language to interact with is sort of very rare when it comes to cultural interactions. In workspace, it's a very different situation. Of course, interaction is compulsory, and in that sense, English is, of course, mandatory, and English was used to interact with each other. But in terms of, let's say, cultural or social interaction, it was very limited among communities from what I have observed, and also the kind of research my participants have also contributed. This was something that they also spoke about. And English with time became this double-edged sword, where on one hand, in order to speak to other communities, you sort of needed this was sort of what bridged, right, everybody together. It sort of brought people together. English on one hand did that, but on the other hand, now research shows that Arabic as a language has deteriorated, right? Nobody uses the language anymore. Arabic has sort of become an endangered language even in today's global world, with and countries like the UAE, Saudi, and all have acknowledged this and tried to bring out policies with regard to this. But like you mentioned, I think a lot of it, as children, as a second generation migrant myself, why I didn't really pick up the language despite the policy of, it's a compulsory language in schools, is the lack of immersion. There's a clear division between a citizen and a migrant, and the national who speaks the language Arabic is clearly kept away from migrant communities. A clear, so it's not like a clear line that they draw, but in terms of social lines, segregation of spaces, it has always existed within the community. Now, again, it has changed a lot comparatively from what the space I grew up in, but still somewhere it does exist. Like you will know that certain cafes is only where the national or the native Arab Emirati would go to, and these are not spaces that migrants can really access. Let's say certain souks or supermarkets where these Arab communities would go to. Schools are the most interesting spaces that way. So the native public schools, the migrant children will not have access to. So again, we would have Indian schools, we would have Filipino schools, we would have schools where Pakistani children would go. So even in that, there was a lot of division within communities, which also exists today, by the way. So it's a clear lack of interaction between the communities that I think where this huge gap is existing, right? And also that hierarchy, like you had mentioned, there's a clear hierarchy within this space. Though we say English is a language where people communicate, Arabic holds a certain sense of power within the community, and those who have access to it sort of have access to spaces, have access to opportunities. It can also exclude you from a lot of spaces. Like, for example, I remember sometimes going to the airport can sometimes be stressful in the earlier times because you don't know the language, though you've grown up there and people mostly speak up. Government spaces where you go to, let's say, for a form or to fill out something, and suppose they're only speaking in Arabic, it sometimes makes you feel left out. Talking to the police sometimes makes you left out. So all of this, certain spaces earlier was certain, it was excluded from the migrant community, and language played a huge role in these sort of exclusive spaces. And I think over time, the deterioration of the language has contributed because of this division and hierarchies and things like that.
Yeah, that's a very unique take on this whole issue of language. That learning language is not just for identity formation, but also for the preservation of the language. I think that's something that we should discuss more, right? That's when we talk about how language propagation can take place. The role of communities and role of education system comes into place, which leads me to the next question. What role do you see for education systems to play in nurturing linguistic diversity, especially in the Gulf, where so many languages exist side by side?
Correct, right? I think education is the best space where we can tackle this problem that we've just spoken about. And I think that's where the gap also exists. So, somewhere, like you had mentioned, UAE as a government is very proactive in promoting the language, which is why they've had this policy of it is compulsory. It's called an additional language, I think, within school. So, it is compulsory that every school sort of teach Arabic to the students. Now it's been taught since, like, let's say junior KG, senior KG, and that's why even now the letters it's there. I cannot erase the idea of these letters. And if you know, Arabic is written from left to right, right, the opposite side. So it's something which you have to get naturalized to. You read from there. Now your brain, because you've been taught to it as children, it's automatically there in your brain. Now there are multiple linguistic theories that talk about this, Kehan, and all of this, how we receive language. So somewhere you are, as migrant children, you are receptive of it, you've taken it in, but the next step of speaking in that language, immersing in that language, how is it practically useful? You only use a language if it's practically useful, right? Maximum migrant children study the language and write it in exams. That's how we used to just by heart it. We know match the following, we know the fill in the blanks. I know it ends in the classroom. I don't have Arabic friends outside my classroom to go speak to, or I don't need to use it anywhere. So the lack of practicality of it, I think, is one thing that we have to address. Again, connecting to the immersion of migrant communities within these spaces. And I think that way we need to really look into. There's a lot of research that has to go into look at how, what again, targeting specific kind of communities, right? How well will it be received? How can we teach it better? Who is teaching it? Now, again, Arabic is a diglossic language in the sense there are multiple dialects to it, and we have an Emirati Arabic, we have a modern standard Arabic. Now, who is teaching these students is also very interesting. These are migrant Arabic teachers who come from Lebanon, Syria. Now, their Arabic is very different from an Emirati Arabic as well, or a modern standard Arabic. So, standardizing Arabic, how is it taught? Who is teaching it? Which community is being taught? The practicality of it. All of this needs to be re-looked at. Also, making students understand that listen, it's important for you to learn the language because it is closely related to your identity and culture in some way or the other. Is also, I think, important on some way. And I don't think it will dilute your migrant identity or your native identity because despite not having language, I know how in myself the Middle Eastern identity somewhere coexists with my native identity in a lot of ways. I cannot say I am from Kerala because a lot of parts of me are still connected to the spaces I grew up. Let it be through the food that I eat, let it be through the notions of dressing up or how I view reality in a lot of spaces is related to the Middle East that I grew up in. So I think within me, these spaces coexist in a very nice way. And I think a gap in that identity has always been language in some form of the other. So I think language will be able to address a lot of these things. And I would really recommend for second generation migrants, especially that book by Uni Krishnan called Temporary People, because he beautifully puts across this kind of liminal space that migrants exist in terms of language. Because he talks about how it's almost like it's seductively attracting us because it's like you can understand it, you are like you hear it and it's like home to you, but you cannot understand it, and that weird liminal space that you exist in is like beautifully represented in that book.
That was Dr. Briji Jose, who shared her thoughts with us on how second generation migrants in the Gulf navigate identity through language, to the way English, Arabic, and our own mother tongue sits in these individual hierarchies. It shows us that how language is not just about words, but it's tied to who we are, where we belong, and how we are seen. Next time, we'll be shifting gears to talk about community and how it shapes identity and belonging for South Asian migrants in the Gulf. And if you haven't already, make sure to check out Deepak Unikrishnan's Temporary People, which we talked about in today's episode. I'll also be sharing a post about the book on our Instagram page, so keep an eye out for that. Thanks for tuning in. And if this episode hit home for you, share it with a friend or send us a message. I'm Ria Abraham, and this is Gulf and Diaspora.